Emmelyn here, live from Dallas, Texas. Thank you so much for joining AsyncAPI's very first online conference. How do you get your organization, your product leaders, your government to adopt the AsyncAPI specification? Quick frame of reference. The API specification should be at the core of all activities. Everything around that will then be systems that balance and integrate a variety of considerations, especially for business stakeholders. And finally, what do people experience? So the toughest part actually about adoption is not the technology itself, it's really your company culture. So I was just gonna show you some ways to really build that alignment that should be focused around the spec and what you can do with that. I'm gonna show you examples of how to get async API visibility and in context with what your company's doing. How do you show async API love and bridge the gap between, hey, this seems like something just deeply technical, why should it matter to me too? Oh wow, I'm incredibly excited with all of the millions of sensors that I can connect and manage, for example. Also, I'll briefly touch on how adopting a spec as the input, that's actually the glue which determines long-term health of your API products and platform and connects it to the rest of the API ecosystem. I found out about AsyncAPI because I wanted to be part of an open source community. So I met Fran, the founder of the spec, and the community is very welcoming. I immediately got involved, not because I'm an expert at event-driven architecture, but because as an API strategist, I wanted to learn more. I was lucky enough to meet Fran in person in Spain, and our product kickoff was in Barcelona. I introduced him to all of our C-level and executive leaders, as well as my colleagues in the greater API community, and vice versa. We sat in the lobby, and what we did was Fran showed me how to work and contribute to the spec, as well as what was in flight for the community and the spec itself. We're super lucky. Alan Dennis and Eric Kresny, CTO and CEO respectively of Stream Data, they were acquired by Axway and had already been working with Ken Lane to contribute to this effort. And so there was already that connection, but I continue to bridge that relationship, and you'll see it reflected in the rest of this talk. So it's really important to weave the async API spec into business context. Tell incredibly interesting stories like the ones we're hearing today. How are you using the spec and focus on the results of the adoption of the spec? You have to tie in the incredible possibilities with the actual how. That's where you're going to need to get your hands dirty. Using async API spec is a standard that helps you move a lot faster. Because it's a sister spec to the Open API spec and the communities actually overlap, you're able to build on a shorter learning curve. So I'll give you an example where a gentleman who was incredibly smart and he was able to turn surveillance on his head in real time. When you have a standard in place that allows you to connect parts of your product to your platform and to your greater ecosystem, such as onboarding a supplier or a vendor faster. A sister spec also helps decrease the learning curve. Async API spec, since it's a sister spec to the OAS spec, Open API, it helps you to do more faster. And the reason why that's important to the health of your API platform is it's a very competitive landscape out there. So when you go to this website featured in the book Burst that talks about human pattern and behavior, you'll see that this gentleman, he's been diligently tracking places that he goes, the food that he eats. And it's just a very interesting data set, especially as it relates to network medicine and helps us to understand patterns of human behavior. Mr. Eric Kresny here, he, as an executive working with major financial institutions and highly able to articulate how artificial intelligence and different API models relate to the adoption of async API, he focuses on the developer community, engineers and architects who are consuming the spec. And so it's really important to stream that data in real time, generate excitement. So governments can now proactively protect its citizens. Companies can do the same, which are the human aspects of event-driven architecture.
Hello, Mr. Yakamoto. Welcome back to the GAP. How does assorted tank tops work out for you?
Minority Report was pretty scary. Remember the scenes of him having to get some eyeball implants. So that's not how we get people excited about the spec. But we can get people excited when it comes to managing, for example, sensors at scale and using machine learning to better manage the asynchronous networks that we build. Another way is to get people excited inside the company. I started gathering all the information and drumming up excitement on our intranet. And at the time, people were just kind of like, I don't really understand what you're talking about. It's just event-driven architecture. Why is that important? I wrote this article in March of 2019. It has 229 views, and you can see that it's got a pretty positive sentiment. We were able to adopt the Async API in one agile sprint using playground.asyncapi.io. I also wrote an article and worked with experts, both inside my company as well as with our good friends at Solace, and worked with Fran and then with Eric. And as you can see, we basically had like an AMA, posed some questions and had each one of them answer the questions. The reference point was what the community is most familiar with, which is REST APIs, as well as people sharing the article. And so I just want to thank this community for doing so and keeping people curious so that we attract the best talent to the spec. It's also really important just to try things out. So I'm seeing in our Slack community channel people asking questions, and I'm incredibly appreciative of the maintainers for addressing them in a quick way. The AsyncAPI Editor is another way that it reminds us of the Open API specification, but now you can use MQTT, Kafka, other protocols, and that means that you get quite a bit of interoperability among those different formats. Again, I mentioned the AsyncAPI Playground. This is fantastic because you can try out different use cases and share them with the community if you can. So in doing all of this, leading by example, some people might be skeptical, but some people might mirror your behavior. So Alan Dennis, in response to all of this contribution that we've made together, he wrote one of many intranet posts. And as you can see, he just published it in January, had 135 views. And then he's written several articles as well and created videos. So I hope that gives you a few ideas of how you can get your company to gain interest in and adopt a specification and kind of tie it back up to that greater API ecosystem. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the questions or on Twitter or your favorite platform.